So our focus today is going to be introducing the book of Revelation and thinking about some issues related to topics like authorship, purpose, audience, as well as this question of how to interpret the book. And as we're kind of thinking about it, we're doing some preparation work. Now, in some cases, when it comes to the Bible, we can often be kind of tempted to think that why not just kind of get into it and just start reading it as opposed to talking about who wrote it, when was it written. Well, in many cases, we have to always remember that the books of the New Testament were written to specific audiences. Whether you come to the Bible as a believer, as a Christian, someone who believes the Bible is from God, or even if you come to it as an atheist, there's that recognition of it was written to specific people in specific places. Revelation is no different in that sense. Right? It was originally written for a specific audience. Now, as a Christian, of course, I believe, and probably most of us believe, that it has meaning for all time. But we have to understand it first in that original setting. And especially with the book of Revelation, I believe understanding a lot of those introductory types of issues, like we would understand of a piece of Shakespeare or a historical letter written by George Washington to anyone in that time period. But especially for Revelation, more so than perhaps some of the other books of the New Testament, really understanding these issues and wrestling with them and thinking through them and determining where do I stand on these issues will affect and shape how you understand this book and what it's about. And I think the best place to start, although we could start in a variety of places, the best place to start is the question of author. Now again, and as a Christian, I certainly believe that God is behind this, the Holy Spirit is behind this, guiding authors into what they wrote, but the Holy Spirit uses human authors. And the documents, majority of the New Testament, usually have some sort of author attached to them, or some sort of indication of author. It's in the author's words. And so God is using these specific people with their specific talents. Anyone who has taken Greek has probably encountered how the Greek of, let's say, something like the Gospel of John is on a different level than the advanced elitist Greek of something like the Gospel of Luke, right? And so God is using the people's talents, He's using their abilities. And so I don't think we want to discount this human author, even if we believe God is ultimately behind this. And of course, even John, once we get into Revelation, he will claim, like, this message came from God through Jesus Christ to His angel and ultimately to the author. So the author, of course, as I've already mentioned, identifies himself as John. But which John? Because he only identifies himself as John. It doesn't really talk about any other descriptors. Which leads us to a couple of conclusions. First of all, John, at least, thinks he's well known. Thinks that all he has to do is say John, and the people reading it will know who he is. Which kind of leads us to the second conclusion. He's known by his audience. This is somebody that would have been familiar to these early Christians. But when we think about the possible Johns from the first century, there are several. Here's a couple that would have been some possibilities. The main one, and the one that probably comes to most minds, is John the Apostle, right? The son of Zebedee, one of Jesus' close followers. And John was even in the inner circle, right? And Jesus had three apostles, three disciples that were very close: Peter, James, and James's brother John. So John the Apostle would certainly have been someone who could just say John, and everybody would know who he was. There is also another possibility, and we'll talk about this more in a little bit, but some have suggested that this John is John the Elder. Now, we'll talk about this in a little bit and clarify who this is. So that's a possibility that has been raised. There's another John, another prominent John in the first century, who's distinct from the apostle and known as the elder. Third possibility that has been mentioned, although it's not gotten much support, is John Mark. Some scholars as well have suggested maybe there is another John in the first century who doesn't fall into any of these other characteristics, but would have been well known to his audience and somebody that would have been recognized. Those are the major possibilities. There are two others that have found some favor, one more than the other. First is what we might call fake John. Somebody whose name really isn't John, but he's using John to write to his audience. Right, so his name's not John, but he identifies himself as John. And then finally, of course, another prominent John during New Testament times was John the Baptist. Really, there has been only one scholar who has suggested John the Baptist is the author of Revelation. And everyone else has gone, no. Right? John the Baptist is the most unlikely possibility for this authorship, simply because he dies during the ministry of Jesus. Yet the author of Revelation is familiar with the entirety of Jesus' life, his crucifixion, his resurrection, things that John the Baptist would not have been alive for. And so John the Baptist has been, again, suggested, but most other scholars have said no. And, he was suggested in the 70s, and, well, it was the 70s, right? And so that's not gotten much favor. But these other ones are ones that have been used by various scholars at various times to suggest that this is the author of Revelation. Let's start with fake John. Now, fake John, of course, is not going to appear in a commentary. Essentially, the idea behind fake John is that this is a pseudonymous writing. Somebody, at some point in time, wrote Revelation using the pseudonym or taking the name of John. So taking the name of a prominent individual. Now, in antiquity, in ancient times, people often used well-known names of other people for writings. So this practice of pseudonymous writing was not unknown, right? And so the idea was, a writing would be more likely to be received by an audience if it was written under a prominent person's name. And so the suggestion is somebody knew that Revelation would be accepted if they used John's name. And so even some Christian writings have been suggested as being written with a pseudonym. However, when it comes to the New Testament, although there are some scholars that would say books like 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus are written by somebody not other than Paul, it's unlikely. The idea of pseudonymous writings was looked upon very unfavorably by Christians in those early centuries. And so it's unlikely that a writing under someone else's name, right, it's not really a John, a prominent John writing this. It's unlikely that Revelation would have been accepted. And so it's very well accepted fairly early along. And usually, pseudonymous writings use the name of prominent people in the past. Revelation is a first century work. And so if they were going to try and present it as, under a fake name, they would have used an older name other than John. And so Revelation would have been written by a contemporary of the apostle or a contemporary of John the Elder, or someone around at the same time for them to say, I didn't write that. Right? And so usually these things were put in the names of people in the past. Finally, when it comes to this idea of fake John, if you're using a pseudonym, if you're claiming somebody else's identity, why not be more specific? And why not really try to, I'm John the apostle, or I'm John the beloved disciple, or I'm, and be more specific other than just John. So it really is unlikely that this author is using a fake name. And so it's probably very likely that the author is somebody named John. But again, it doesn't help us, right? Because we still are left with several other Johns. What about the possibility of there's some other prominent John who was well known to the people of the time? Well, one of the things to consider about that is that if there existed another John during the first century, that has been lost to history. There are no other records by any early Christian sources. There are no other indications that there was another prominent John. So, if this is somebody else named John, why is he not identifying himself more fully? Because he wouldn't have been somebody prominent. And so the likelihood that it isn't a prominent John, that is just some guy named John, doesn't seem to fit either. And so now we get into the three that have some more likelihood to them. Right? People that we know existed. The first is John Mark. John Mark, believed to be the author of the second gospel, had been a companion of Paul, a companion of Peter, was a relative of Barnabas. Right? So well known in several early Christian writings from the first century, many in the New Testament. However, John Mark is only identified as John Mark in the book of Acts. Every other place that he's identified, in the writings of Paul and the writings of Peter, he's always referred to as just simply Mark. So there's not historical evidence that John Mark ever went by the name John. Right? And so he's known as John Mark or simply as Mark, never John. So the likelihood that this refers to John Mark is also very low. Which leaves us then with two real options. Two that have the most support. The first is John the Elder. Eusebius, a 4th century Christian historian, records a writing by a second century Christian named Papias. So Eusebius is the historian. He's writing about a 2nd century Christian named Papias. Papias identifies in his comments another early Christian called John the Elder or John the Presbyter. The word translated presbyter is also the word that's translated elder. They're the same word in Greek. And so Eusebius seems to indicate that Papias said there were two Johns that were prominent in the first century, John the Apostle and John the Elder, or John the Presbyter. And additionally, if you look at the author of 2 John and 3 John, in both cases the author identifies himself as simply the elder. The problem with this John the Elder is that there's no other indication in any other Christian writings that he is somebody distinct from John the Apostle. And there are ways to read Papias where he is not talking about two different people, he's talking about the same person. And so the idea that there was this guy, John the Elder, is not that firm. Which leaves us predominantly with one individual that appears to be the most likely author of Revelation, John the Apostle, the son of Zebedee. Several early Christians attributed the authorship of Revelation to John the Apostle. People living in the 2nd century like Justin and Irenaeus, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, and even into the 3rd century, people like Origen. And so several prominent early Christians said Revelation was written by the Apostle. Now, there were a few early Christians that argued against apostolic authorship, but not too many. So given that there's a lot of early evidence that the author of Revelation, identifying himself as John, is John the Apostle, why is it that some people don't accept that idea? What is it that leads them to question this? Well, there are essentially two issues. The first issue has to do with the author of Revelation's use of Greek. I won't get too technical with this, but the Greek of Revelation is very unusual. The author improperly uses, at least according to standard Greek rules, improperly uses the cases of different nouns, right? So if you've taken a foreign language like Spanish or French, you know, like depending on how a word is used, if it's the subject of the sentence or if it's the object of the sentence, it might have a different ending. Well, that's the same thing in Greek. Right? Depending on how a word's used in a sentence, it's going to have a different ending. John doesn't always follow those rules. Sometimes he uses inappropriate cases. Sometimes he uses inappropriate genders. Right? When it comes to noun usage, right? Nouns in everything other than English just about have genders. They're sometimes masculine, feminine, or neuter. John just kind of plays with that sometimes and doesn't always make things line up. And so there's that part of it. You know, it's kind of an unusual Greek. And especially when compared to the fourth gospel believed to be written by the Apostle John. You know, there's some differences between these documents in the vocabulary. The usage rules seem to be followed in the Gospel of John, but not in Revelation. And so people have said they can't be the same author. Right? There's just too much trouble in this Greek to say that these are the same author. But others have tried to say, well, maybe there are some explanations. Some have suggested that when John wrote what's now known as the fourth gospel, he used an amanuensis, or essentially a secretary. And he dictated to somebody who was a professional writer who would have cleaned up some of the inappropriate case usages, gender usages, right? So he made sure to proofread. So that's been suggested as a possibility, right? There's a secretary behind the Gospel of John, and Revelation is just kind of John writing on his own. Others have suggested that the format of Revelation, because it's visions, these ecstatic experiences, that John is trying to write them down really, really rapidly, and because of that he's not always paying attention to case and gender and some other things. A third suggestion has been that John, as a Jew, is using a Hebrew mind to write Greek. And so it's kind of a Hebraic Greek instead of a traditional Greek. And so that's been an attempt to explain. And people said, you know, John in Revelation uses a lot of Old Testament references. Right? So that might be the influence there. Or it could be that John is breaking the rules to make specific points. Right? And so he's changing things up with the rules to kind of demonstrate, you know, there's something important here for his audience to see, that audience that would have read early Greek. A second thing that is usually pointed to say it's probably not the Apostle John has to do with the theology presented in Revelation. And people will say, when you look at the theology of Revelation, it differs from the theology of the Gospel of John in a couple of distinct ways. One thing people point to is the way that God is presented in both documents. In the Gospel of John, they say, God is a God of love looking to convert the world. In Revelation, God is a God of wrath and judgment. Right? And so they'll say, you know, there's a different depiction of God here. You know, in one God's love, the other one God's judgment, unlikely the same person. Well, when you read through these documents, you can see wrath in the Gospel of John, and you can see love in the book of Revelation. Right? And so they're not that incompatible when you really get into it. And of course, a lot of it would have to do with the differences related to the message being presented. I mean, you can believe in a God of love, but if you're trying to warn somebody of something, you might emphasize, right, God's going to bring judgment upon people that do such and such things. Right? And so the fact that God's presented slightly differently doesn't mean that there are two different authors here. A second thing that people pointed to when it comes to differences between the Gospel of John and Revelation, they've said, well, in the Gospel of John, belief, having the appropriate beliefs, having faith, is very important. Conversion is very important in the Gospel of John. These kind of things are emphasized in Revelation. Well, again, it could be the difference is due to what this document is meant to do, who it's written towards. And really, when you look at it, you can find some of those things, the importance of belief, the importance of conversion. You can find those in Revelation. So again, doesn't necessarily mean that there are two different authors. A third thing that people point to theologically are the titles of Jesus. Now, certainly, everybody would say, in Revelation and in John, the Gospel of John, similar titles are used. Jesus referred to as a lamb. Jesus referred to as the Son of God. Jesus referred to as the Word. Right? All of these terms are used in both of these documents, but they're used differently. Right? And so it's unlikely that again, this is the claim, it's unlikely that the author of Revelation is using these titles in the same way as the author of the Gospel of John. But only in both of these documents, in Revelation and the Gospel of John, is Jesus the Logos, the Word. Right? And so if you think back to the opening of the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word, the Greek word Logos. Right? And that's the only time in the New Testament that term is used for Jesus, in the Gospel of John and in the book of Revelation. And so we're talking about genre differences. We're talking about purpose differences, not authorship differences. In fact, the fact that so many of the same titles are used suggests unity of authorship, not differences. And then finally, the theological differences over the use of the Spirit. And in the Gospel of John, the Spirit is the paraclete. Right? That's the Greek word, the comforter, the helper, the advocate. In Revelation, it's not this comforter, advocate, helper. It's the seven spirits of God, which we'll talk about as we get into the text. Here again, is it a difference in authorship, right, suggesting there's two authors here, or is it a difference because of the visionary experience that John is going through, the symbolic nature of this document? So, having considered all of that, I would say that what appears to be most likely, although we can't say 100% certain, but what appears to be most likely is that the author of Revelation is the author of the fourth gospel, John the Apostle, the son of Zebedee. We'll see in some other places how this might be important, but even if it is, even if there was that John the Elder, that doesn't affect us too much. It's not to say, well, now we can't be certain about anything. Right? But still, it appears to be a good position to take that John the Apostle is the author. Questions, comments about authorship?